Simran Kaur is a financial columnist, international TEDx speaker, and founder of Girls That Invest, the number one global podcast aimed at increasing financial literacy for women and minorities everywhere. So, Girls That Invest, your guide to financial independence through shares and stocks, is a book on the subject, and it's a book that I read, which was excellent. So, before we begin, I've got to ask, so why are we afraid of money and why should we invest?
Firstly, I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me on here. I'm very excited. It's going to be a great conversation. When it comes to why we should be investing and why it's important, I think there's so many reasons, but the number one reason that sticks to me the most is that investing is often the difference for us between having a life that we want, which is abundant and full of lots of choices, because when you have more money, you have more choices, versus having a life where maybe you're saving a lot and that's awesome and you're putting it into cash, but you're not getting the same results and you might be maybe making some sacrifices in life that you shouldn't have to.
Yeah, that's really true, and you know, we sort of grew up with kind of being afraid of money quite a lot, and that seemed to be the case. It was always like a worry. So I don't know if it's the case for a lot of other people, which I'm sure it is, especially at a time like this. But I think there is like a stigma, isn't it, towards dealing with our finances. Uh,
It really is. I think the stigma also comes from the fact that we're just kind of conditioned that way. Like, if you think back to your childhood and you think back to your first memory, your first conversations with money, it's often with your parents, telling you off or asking about money or making you feel like it's very hush hush, like, don't ask your auntie and uncle about, that financial situation that's very obvious. And so things like that just start to creep up. And I think there's no like one big talk that you get that makes you fearful of money. It's just all these little things that start adding up.
Yeah, no, totally. I'm like, that definitely happened when I was growing up. It was always sort of an issue. So, you end up having a really bad relationship with it as a result. It's sort of like a scarcity mentality. So it just kind of follows you around when you go. And the other aspect is like, why do you think we don't really understand a lot of the terms and jargon, like inflation? And like, why do they make the jargon so complicated as well?
Oh my goodness, right? I mean, I just for the longest time used to think like when people said this company is raising capital, I was like, that's so impressive. They were just raising money. Like that was no different to a fundraiser. And yet here I was thinking that they were doing something so impressive. This is my theory when it comes to jargon. I think back in the day, jargon was used specifically to make you feel like, oh my goodness, this is like another language, and I would rather trust someone else to take care of my money because I do not have the time or the energy to understand what's going on. And when we talk about money and finances in our book or in our podcast, often people go, wow, like that is really simple. And I'm like, yes, every concept with investing and money is so simple, but the jargon just like fluffs it up a bit and makes it look like it's so much more harder than it is, but nothing is, outside of your reach of understanding.
Yeah, it is complicated, and I do wonder whether I remember reading a book and they said like sometimes that sort of barrier through language is created so there's a level of exclusivity, and that you want to be part of that exclusive club, essentially. So a lot of like companies will use specific jargon um, associated with their company just so that you feel part of the club. So I do wonder whether there is that aspect of making it complicated so that you feel kind of exclusive when you're also investing. But also, I was just wondering, like, you know, at the moment, obviously, we're going through a bit of turmoil through the economic crisis that we're going through, especially in the UK. We had a
hmm
double whammy of Brexit and all sorts. And so, how do we deal with things like savings at a time of like financial slump and recession?
It's such a good question. And I think, honestly, my first answer to this is that it comes from such a place of privilege to even be able to say, hey, there's an economic crisis, can I even do anything about it? Do I have enough cash stored, or can I start putting more away? But I think there's two things that we can do during these times just to, I guess, get us through the season. It is so difficult right now. Cost of living is extremely high. We're starting to see companies, especially in the tech sector, starting to have layoffs, which is very, very scary. And the first thing that I always talk about is the idea of making sure that you are not replaceable. Oops. Making sure that you're irreplaceable in your jobs, because right now is a time where companies start to realize, well, people aren't spending because cost of living is so high. So now we're not making a lot of profits. And they start to look inwards and go, well, is there any, meat we could cut out? Is there any
Mm.
extra fat in this company that we don't really need right now? And maybe we still need them, but we can't afford them. And so, one thing that's important to do is look around and see what you can do within the brand that you're in. I mean, this is more for people that work a 9 to 5, to kind of show that you've got your fingers in different departments and different areas, and you've got something that's so valuable that it makes sense for them to hold on to you. And that can look like having a conversation with your manager and going, hey, I'd love to upskill. What else do you need help with? I've got an extra hour a week, which, might not be a lot of your time, but for them might mean a lot. Or, hey, I've started watching some online courses to help in my job just so I can, get better at what I'm doing. That's step one, making sure that you can have a job that sustains you through this time. And that's going to maybe one day hopefully increase your income too. And then number two, the second most important thing is having an emergency fund. And an emergency fund is about 3 months of your living expenses saved up just in a bank account. You don't have to invest it. You don't have to do anything fancy with it. And that's just in case, we do lose our jobs, or our car breaks down, or your laptop dies and you need something instantly. You have dental, work, and, we all know how expensive that can get. During normal times, it's important to have an emergency fund, but during economic crises, even just putting $10 aside every week into an account that you don't touch might be the difference between you having to let go of something quite important or being able to fund yourself for the next couple of months.
That's so helpful. It really that really stuck in my mind, because I think you don't really know how much to keep essentially in your savings, because you just save and save, but without real kind of a goal essentially. So it was really helpful to know that having that specific number of like 3 months of your salary was really helpful to be like, that's enough. You don't need to panic after that. If there's like less than that, it's okay. So it was really good to know there was like a specific amount. But with the thing is that from the last recession, I am that old. It was really, really scary to have like to invest in companies and then also have savings in specific banks. But obviously, a lot of companies went into administration, and so did banks. So I'm just wondering, is there a worry that after you invest, those kind of things will happen? And so, is there some level of safety for the money that you've invested?
That is such a great question. With cryptocurrency, funnily enough, that started out after the GFC because someone recognized that they didn't feel like they could trust banks, and they were like, what if they go away? So let's create a decentralized way of keeping my money. Now, I'm not by any means saying put your cash into crypto, it will never go down, because that's not true either. But what you can do to safeguard your money is banks have what we call ratings. And a rating of a bank can be, it's quite like, it's almost as if they're getting graded on a paper. They get an A, a triple A, a double A, a B, a C, a C minus. There's all these grades available. And you want to make sure that the bank that you're with has the best rating possible. So we're talking double A, triple A. These are ways that allows you to recognize the risk of the bank collapsing. And so there are some banks out there, especially online banks or smaller banks, that will, maybe offer you higher rates, or they have more appeal to them, or they're more, nicer to look at when you use their online interface, but their credit rating is lower. They're a B or a C. And those are the banks where they might be more at risk of losing your money. But often banks also have insurance associated with it. So with investments specifically, if you invest, I think for some banks up to $200,000, they will give you back up to $200,000. So checking
Mm.
bank policies might be something that doesn't sound very exciting or fun, but you can check and see what you're covered for with the bank that you're with. And if it surprises you, you can find one with a better credit rating, because yeah, it's scary. We don't want our money to suddenly disappear. That would be the worst thing that could happen in a time like this.
So yeah, and so exactly. So The Big Short was such an important part. I watch it once a year, almost as a way to jolt myself into being like, be aware of what's happening around you. And so it does scare me. So I have to ask you, is the market fundamentally corrupt though?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it depends on who you're asking and what you want out of it. So, when it comes to the share market, for example, there are people that have very strong opinions on it. But to me, I just try to look at it as black and white as possible. And maybe that's the wrong way of looking at it. But the way I see it is there are companies out there, and when you put your $100 into a share of a company, you're hoping that if the company does well and other investors see value in it, that $100 share will turn into a $150 share after a couple of years, and you make some money off that. Now, there's also other ways of investing which are maybe you could say more slimy. And so we might recall with the hedge funds, Melvin Capital last year, or was it the year before now? I think time's just a blur. They were investing money on the basis that GameStop shares were dropping. So the
Yeah.
more GameStop was doing poorly, the more this hedge fund was making money. And that's it. It's called shorting. And, that seems a little bit disingenuous almost, or you're making money off the demise of another company. And so I think there are definitely some examples that I don't agree with, but if you're looking at black and white investing in the share market for your long term, retirement, then I think it can benefit the everyday person.
Yeah, that GameStop example is just brilliant because I remember that when that happened and all the Reddit users just basically completely obliterating that hedge fund, which was quite I have to say quite fun to watch. So yeah, it was such a great example. And oh God, I was going to ask you about that example because unfortunately, a lot of my friends who are at Twitter all lost their jobs last week. So it was pretty devastating. And, it is the thing is, people forget it was a struggling company. It
Mm.
has been struggling for a long time. But obviously, because you're using it, you don't necessarily see the actual financial kind of situation that it's in. So, how do we trust companies to actually invest in them, especially if you have exactly people like Elon Musk running these companies?
A few things that I look at when I'm trying to decide if I trust a company is looking at its leadership and how it handles internal leadership worries, but also how it handles PR. Because a company that has a leader that can handle crises well or admits when they're wrong is something that you almost see trickle down in the rest of the company. And you don't have to be a stock market expert to know this. We've all worked in companies where the product might be great or the brand might be awesome, but if management is poor, then that company has high turnover, that company does not produce well, the workers are not interested. Like, we're tired, we're
Mm.
busy. And so that ends up affecting the bottom line and eventually how the share performs long term. So, company leadership is a huge red flag or green flag. The other thing I like to look for is the product. What are they doing to improve it? So, Apple is a really great example
Mm.
where they don't need to update the iPhone every year, but they will try and convince you that like one little thing they've changed is worth buying the new phone, and people continue to buy it. And it's because they've put so much effort into the product, into the packaging, the marketing, And they've really nailed that down. So when a company has a good product and good leadership, that makes a huge difference.
Yeah, that's the weirdest thing about Apple products. They never seem to depreciate. I have rubbish products usually because I am a cheapskate, but my partner always has like Apple type products. He sells it and he always gets his money back, and I sell my things and I get nothing. So I definitely see the difference in certain brands. When you buy into them, you definitely get your return for it. So it's like, okay, maybe I need to do that a bit more. But like obviously, we're talking about girls that invest, that really sort of targeted, obviously for one, women and people of color. And so, do you feel that women and people of color are kind of just on the tail end of a lot of sort of financial things where they're just not included on at the table in relation to investing in general?
Oh, absolutely. I think both in the professional world and also in our personal lives, we are not perceived as people that want to know about money, care about money time and time again. There's been a lot of data that people think, or financial advisors or people in the industry think that women are just risk adverse. And we would rather leave it up to our fathers. And when we get married or if we have a partner, we transfer the worry of finances to them. And it's so odd because if you go and speak to any woman, she'll be like, yeah, of course, like I want to be financially secure and I want to have my own money and I want to have things taken care of. I just don't know where to start. It's not that I don't want to, there just hasn't been a person or a brand or a resource that has resonated with me and felt like I could reach out and learn how to do things. I've had friends that went to a bank. There was this one friend, she was maybe 22 or 23 at the time, went to a bank, had $10,000, which is a lot of money for a young person, and said, hey, I've got this money. I want to be smart with it. How do I invest it? And the bank person told her to come back when she had a few more zeros at the end of that number. So was he asking her to come back when she had $100,000 in
Oh
cash or $1
God.
million in cash to invest? I mean, that is absurd. And this was only a few years ago. And so you can imagine, even when women are proactive, it's not that we're not trying, we still get turned away. So it's just been so difficult to have a place where we can talk about money and feel almost respected as adults for our opinions instead of, these children like creatures where we need a man to help us out.
Now, do you think the tide is turning there are we getting better? Because obviously we're much more, there's many more sort of career driven women these days. So I'm just wondering, is it changing?
I think it's starting to change, and a lot of data has shown that as female investors, we tend to be better than our male counterparts. Not that it's a competition, but when it comes to stock market portfolio returns, on average, we do about 0.4 to 1% better each year. And you might go, Simran, that's a tiny amount, but every year that compounds and it starts to really add up. Even fund managers, female fund managers outperform male fund managers when it comes to investments. And so, one, we're starting to see people go, okay, even though we might not feel like we're confident, we're clearly good at what we do.
Mm.
And diversity is always good when it comes to business. I think businesses are starting to recognize this, not just within the investing world, but in general. When you have people that don't look like you and sound like you, they're going to turn up with their own views and opinions that you can try your best, but you could just not have thought of it yourself because you didn't live their experience. And so to have more investments in companies that come from women or come from people of color, those companies tend to do really well as well. So we're definitely starting to see a change.
That's really good news. Before I get to the last question, because it is true. It's just like God, I haven't seen many women in the sort of financial field, or who haven't been driven out of the financial field, just because of the culture that it sort of brings about, the very Wall Street, Wolf of Wall Street culture. But I have to ask you, so you've written a book about different kind of investors. So what kind of investor are you?
Oh, this is a good one. For those that don't know, within the book, I kind of break down like the lazy investor, the female investor, the ethical investor. And one thing that people don't realize is that you don't have to just be one. People think I've got to be like the investor that's active and looking at 5 screens and doing all this crazy stuff that you see in movies like Wolf of Wall Street. But I would say I'm probably a mixture of all three. I'm definitely a lazy investor. So most of my money is tied up in ETFs or funds, which means that rather than trying to pick and choose different companies or wonder, is BP doing well or is, Vodafone doing well, I just look at, well, if I invest in an entire fund like the S&P 500, which is the top 500 companies in America, or the FTSE 100, which is the top 100, companies in the UK, then my money is diversified and I don't have to worry about one company doing well or doing poorly because it's spread and so the risk is spread as well. I would also then say I am a little bit of an ethical investor, and so I will look at if there are companies in a fund that I don't agree with, then I might not invest in that fund because I believe I can vote with my voice. And then the female investor, which is the type of investor who doesn't check their portfolio as often, who trusts their gut, who sticks to a plan. I think I'm a little bit of that, but if I had to pick, definitely the lazy investor. To me, investing should not be the main focus of my life. It should be something that I do that is chugging along or ticking along on the side, and therefore I can then go and enjoy my life because money is to be enjoyed and it's a tool, but it's not something that should have to consume you because that's no way to live either.
Yeah, no, definitely, and I would agree with you. I feel like I would, if I was investing, that's exactly the kind of investor I'd want to be as well, which is ethical and lazy, because I don't want to deal with it either. I think it just gives me also a lot of anxiety to constantly having to look at it, which is good that you said actually it's better not to look at it all the time, just see it once a quarter or something, or once a month, which I think is actually much better for people's anxiety, anyways. So I think, yeah. So again, Simran, thank you so much for speaking with me. I'm like really, really helpful information and also so important.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate the time and such great questions. I hope if someone's listening to this, what they can take away, or what my dream would be, is that they can take away that it isn't hard, it's not difficult, it's just made to feel that way. But I promise you, read the book, listen to the podcast, do what you need to. It doesn't have to be ours, but you'll realize it is so much easier than you think.
Yeah, definitely. I've got to just go ahead and do it, bite the bullet and do it, for sure. So thanks, Simran. I really appreciate it.